Today's episode is brought to you by Apprentice Academy. Apprentice Academy is my audio production and engineering school based out of the West Barn in Nashville, Tennessee. We have a 16-week program that puts you in the driver's seat, totally immersed in the studio, learning techniques, learning technology, learning everything we talk about here on the podcast, which is how to get in a room and stay in a room, all the nuances of the music business. We love this program. It's a great time. We'd love to talk to you more about it. Hit us up at apprenticeacademy.net. There's a lot of information there as well as a contact. We have a 2021 fall semester starting the last week of August. We also provide virtual classes. So if you can't come to Nashville and participate with us, we've got a great virtual program as well. Reach out. We'd love to talk to you at apprenticeacademy.net.
Hey everybody, welcome to From the West Barn. Today we have a really special episode. I'm going to talk to Joe about his journey to where he got today. It's a pretty interesting story. And for those that don't know, my partner Joe West From the West Barn, it's kind of a big deal. He's had 3 number ones as a songwriter, including Toby Keith, Keith Urban, Jimmy Wayne. Joe's also won Grammys for producer and mixer for the famous gospel record of Joey and Rory, just previous to her death, unfortunately. He's also mixed Flyleaf, Justin Timberlake, Shakira. He's worked with such legends as Malcolm Byrne and Daniel Lanois and Emmylou Harris. But anyways, today's guest is my bro, Joe West. So anyways, man, this is really interesting to me because I know your full story of how you got where you are. And, we met in New York City, but you have a whole story leading up to even getting to New York City, much less Nashville. So you started in Pittsburgh.
This is true. But to preface all of this, I think that I think why this is a cool idea for us to maybe talk about is that your journey is never what you expect it to be, but it's very unknown to each of us. And we always are like, we want to be here. We want to be doing this thing, but how we get there is seldomly the way we anticipated getting there. Exactly. Right.
They always say it's never the straight line. It's the zigzaggy.
Be careful what you pray for, because you just might get it, but you won't get your prayers answered the way you think. Like you're so desperately saying, God, let me get this thing. And you don't realize if you got it, your whole trajectory might be shut off into outer space and you wouldn't get there. So I think that today will be a cool thing. And I want to ask you some questions too about your journey. I think it's cool because the overriding, even though this story makes sense when you read it back in the end, the real trick is just living the story, finding opportunity in trying to make the right decisions along the way and realizing that none of those decisions are so important or so pivotal that they're going to change where you're supposed to be. You always end up where you're supposed to be. Right. And luckily I was supposed to be in Nashville, making records, and, it just took a while. It took me 20 years to get there. But yes, I started off in Pittsburgh as an audio engineer. And
were you in bands? How did you even how did you get to know the studios where I'm meant to be?
Well, I was in bands. I was, that whole thing where you're just like, you're in horrible bands with your friends, right? And you think you're the best band out there. And
sure.
And then you see a real band and, you get blown off of a couple stages and you realize, oh, wow.
So at some point you had enough self-awareness to go, maybe being a musician, like an actual instrumentalist, is maybe not for me.
Well, you could get there, but it's a matter of like, do you want that life? Is it really worth it? But then when something else shows up and you're like, oh, wow, what did we just do? We just went in the studio, made this thing. And it's like, that whole process was getting to do it. I was like distracted by it. It was like, oh, this is really, I want to spend more time doing this. And then the next thing you know, it's like you make a record for your band and then people say, hey, would you make a record for my band? And it's like of no consequence. You're like, yeah, I'm just going to go do this record for my band. There's a band in Pittsburgh called Anti-Flag, which ended up being a famous punk rock band. And I produced probably 2 or 3 records for them. And it was the equivalent of that, which was like, hey, can you mix this? Can you help us fix this? It was done in Andy's bedroom with like a drummer. We're going through laundry shoots, So it didn't feel like a big deal.
How do you even get to that point? Okay. So you're you're playing in bands. How do you start? Do you get a job at a studio? Do you buy some equipment? This is previous to Pro Tools and everything.
Right. You make a record. Your band goes in and records a record. Number one. And you're oblivious until you get there. And then you're like, what was that? What did we just do? That was incredible. And then it was like, it starts to occupy your mind more than playing occupied my mind. Because when you play, you're done at the end of the night. There's always those magic moments. You know, I played on the stage of the Ryman to a sold out crowd at the Ryman. And it was like, the moment was so incredible, but it's fleeting. It goes away at the end of the night.
Right.
But when you make a record, it gets bigger after you're done with it. Yeah. It becomes more epic. And then you can't even explain the record because the accidents you made on the record actually are embraced as genius later, you know, and it just, if it becomes popular. And there was something about that. And it was like, I heard Adam Carolla talking about how everything he does goes up and out through a transmitter tower and out into the universe or out on the internet. And it was like, it disappears. And it was like, I think a little bit of what we do is like, hey, how can you show your kid what you did? Right. But it was like, you can't take it back in time because it was a live experience. Being in the studio was that I started to do records for other bands, help my friends make records. Right. Turn my phone off. I hate it when people don't turn their phones off. And I started to then do more records. And then I was trying to go to Berkeley in Boston, couldn't afford it, got accepted, but just couldn't swing the money. And then there was this opportunity where my dad was had worked in the steel mill for 20 years and then worked as in the maintenance facility for the post office. So he essentially was fixing machines and fixing elevators, fixing, escalators. And he said, why don't you go up to KDKA in Pittsburgh, the big AM station, and why don't you see if you could be a janitor there? And I was like, looking back at that, I could see how I would be like, Dad, what do you think? I'm not going to go. But I was actually like, oh, that's a great idea. I just felt like if I could get close to it, I could eventually get in there and start to talk to people and eventually do something. Right. And so happens that a friend of mine was going to the Art Institute of Pittsburgh and they had not built their studios yet. So they were working in a studio on the north side called Audiomation. And Greg Vizza, who was my mentor, he took a meeting with me and I asked him if I could sweep his floors. And he said, I need an engineer. I don't need a janitor. And in my infinite lack of wisdom, not knowing anything, not knowing how hard it was to actually do that and what level of talent you needed, I said, I could do that. It's just dumb enough to do it and young enough. And he just single-handedly willed me into being an engineer because he needed it. He was super patient, cut my teeth there for 8 years, moved to New York for 10 years.
Greg was willing to teach you how to engineer?
There's a great story about a band called the Little Ratchets, who was an underground band, relatively popular in their genre. And they were famous for coming in the recording studio and recording 17 songs in an afternoon. That was like what they did. And Audiomation was a big studio with lots of ISO booths. And I was this guy that was like second to Greg Viz. I was his second engineer. So I'd run out and change a mic, or I'd go out and mic up the drum kit. He'd come in and then he would say, okay, go ahead and do this. And I was just like the band didn't even really acknowledge me because I was kind of by proxy an arm of Greg Vizza. So Greg's doing this record and he's, experienced, he knows what he's doing. And then he said, hey, go ahead and record him. I'm going up to my office.
This is the first time you've ever been in the studio with Greg?
No, I had been maybe in for 5 months.
Oh, okay.
But I had learned enough to know that that my imposter syndrome was at an all-time peak. I realized how I had been thrown into the deep end of the pool, and I realized that I was incapable. But with Greg there, I had a friend that was a lifeguard next to me, and I was safe and sound. But then he went upstairs, and he said, do it. And I was literally sweating, anxiety, and I did such a horrible job recording this band, the Little Ratchets, because they were in ISO booths and they want to talk to each other in between takes, and you had to flick the tape machine into input. And when they couldn't talk to each other, of course, they were frustrated, rightfully so. They were used to doing 17 songs in an afternoon. Maybe they did 3 or 4. I don't remember, but I do remember they actually mailed a letter through the United States Postal Service to the recording studio. A letter showed up from the Little Ratchets, and they officially requested on paper that I was not to be in the building when they recorded.
Your very first gig by yourself?
It was, yes, it was. If it wasn't the first, it was one where I just gotten hit by a tsunami of like, I was way above my pay grade and I failed miserably. And I learned from that it was like, okay, I don't want to do that again. Over prepare, all this stuff, but it was one of those seminal moments where it was like, this is tough. It's tougher than I thought it was. And it might be better than I am. It might be too big of a task for a guy like me. That's what I learned early on.
What was Greg's reaction to that? Just out of curiosity.
Greg,
did he say, don't worry about it, we're going to get through it?
I don't remember. I also put a 7-foot Yamaha C7. It was on big casters. I was swinging it around the room to move it, and it slipped out of my grip, and it crashed into the two panes of 5/8 inch plexiglass that separated the isobooths and ruined 2 of them. And he didn't fire me for that either. So I don't know. Greg is a person.
Saint.
It's part of why I'm convinced that this was supposed to be part of my story, because anyone else would have fired me. It was like, of course I ended up, if you go back and take out any of those instances, I might not have ended up where I'm at. And I'm so glad I ended up where I am, just I'm happy as a person, not even creatively or successful. I'm just, you look back at it and it all makes sense. That's the big moral of this story, which is I was so stressed out about getting there as a kid because there was so much unknown. And I felt like every decision was the biggest decision of my life. And if I screwed it up, I would screw up my career.
Right.
Don't worry about that. You'll look back at your career and you'll say, oh, that reads perfectly like a story, like a book that I would open.
Right.
And it reads perfectly throughout the whole scope of the storyline. And there's no reason why he should have kept me. He was just that kind of guy. He was a brilliant guy, but he was so smart, but he was just he thought differently. Right. And he was accepting. He wasn't going to let me fail, in other words. And he didn't. And by 8 years later or 6 years later, I was the chief engineer of that place doing symphony sessions, satellite remotes to the BBC in London for James, and, incredible technical feats where we're syncing 2 multi-track machines, a bunch of MIDI gear, and slaving the record deck, 2-track machine. Incredible feats of just logistical feats that you're like, I didn't know I was capable of that. Just happens. It's war of attrition.
One thing I've always noticed about you, strangely, is as much knowledge as you have, we come from slightly different worlds where, I'm heavier into the programming world. You're not a guy that's ever afraid to ask, how do you do that? Which I think a lot of people in your position wouldn't do. They're just like, they kind of like I remember you asking me some questions about MIDI, and this is way back when they had introduced the instrumental tracks into Pro Tools. And you at that point in time, I think most of the work you were doing was bringing in session guys, and you were doing these pretty big sessions with live instruments in the barn, which is a whole thing that I don't even get into. That's not even that's overwhelming to me. But I just thought it was really interesting that even with all your experience level, you're not afraid to ask questions.
Well, there's not. Greg also taught me this other thing, which was like, hey, if you don't know, just shut up. People will assume you know.
Right. Yeah.
That's good for a lot of things when it's not relevant to something you're responsible for. But if you're responsible for it, I went out once to a harpist, not like harp, like through a bullet mic and a Fender amp, but a harpist, like symphony harpist, where she's sitting behind a giant harp. And I remember walking around it 2 or 3 times, and I was still like, where does the sound come from on this instrument? And I'm putting my ear, and I'm like, okay, it sounds kind of good here. It sounds kind of good there. But then I just said to her, hey, where do people mic this? Musicians really appreciate it. Horn players, string players, they're like, oh, it sounds really good when you do. And I know how to do all that by now, but I still will, to this day, I'll say to somebody, hey, where do you usually mic it?
Yeah.
And they secretly love it, number one.
Sure.
And they feel like, oh, this guy respects me, and he's accommodating to me. He wants to know what I think. And then on top of it, you find out some things you didn't know. And then it's like, why not? Now I know that. Now it's mine. That's the best thing with knowledge. And I do this at the Apprentice Academy, the school. I give people knowledge. I give them like a world-class drum sound. You can get, I tell them, we're going to do a session today. We're going to get a world-class drum sound. It could, the session we do today, it could be a number one song and it could be a Grammy award-winning record. I guarantee it before we put one mic down, because it's a knowable thing. And I'm not going to stop. I know what that is. I'm not going to stop till we're there. And I say, I'm giving you this. Right. It's yours now. It's simple because it is an answer. Like when you say, hey, I worked on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And the thing about Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which is incredible, is you don't have to be a genius. You just have to know a lot about a lot of different things, from a helicopter to a color palette to the Olympics in 1970, whatever, right? So you have to have a wide berth of knowledge. And that's what this is. You have to know a lot of things, and you have to be willing to ask what that is. You have to be able to be open to it. But once you give somebody that knowledge, it's theirs.
Right.
And all these guys, I'm like, don't be me, be your version, your impression of the information I give you, but you have it. Right. You know how to get a great guitar sound. There's a moment in the class where I have an amp in an ISO booth and they're all standing behind the speakers. And I say, move the mic, don't EQ this. And I just take an SM57, the simplest of mics that's every live gig, and I put it on one side of the cone. And then I have someone play the guitar. And as I move it across the cone, from the outside, the 3 o'clock position, into the 12 o'clock position, and back out through the 9 o'clock position, I look at their faces in the other room and they're dumbfounded at the difference in tone from moving that mic. And now they know that. They can't unknow that. So I look at it like, hey, I'm naturally curious. I like anything. I could get into, I'll watch a documentary about the silliest of things just because things intrigue me. But once I give that information to a kid at Apprentice Academy, well, then they'll go do that. And they will have that in their satchel of assets. But they'll put their fingerprint on it. So they'll never sit behind a console and mix like me, for better or for worse. They'll never do that. They'll take all the tricks I teach them. Cord Phillips was an engineer that worked for me for 8 years. Great engineer. Knew all of my tricks. And his record sounded totally different than mine in a beautiful way. Ron Petroff, Chris Capp, the list goes on and on. All these guys that have gone through the program, they take it and metabolize it. That's a great thing about music. And that's what, that is what I think is really, be free, be willing to ask questions, and then take it somewhere that the other person didn't. Put it through your DNA. As a songwriter and as a record producer and as a mixer, I tell people, find what you do that's a little bit different and lean into that, because nobody can do that. You'll take the same stimuli as everyone else and your output will be uniquely yours. And that's where you get paid money. That's where people will say, hey, we got to go to that guy because that's the sound of that record.
Right. Okay. So you spend 8 years in Pittsburgh working at Audiomation. Right. You get to pretty much the top of the heap in Pittsburgh. One of the guys that's, if you're making a record seriously, if you're making a record, I'm on that list. You work with a lot of the top bands in Pittsburgh that I was familiar with back in the day. All right. So at what point do you say, okay, I've kind of like peaked out here. It's time to move to New York City? I told the story recently about the band High Voltage, a heavy rock band like Saigon Kick, that Ron St. Germain had flown into town to steal this gig from me. And I was so elated that he did that, that it was worthy to be stolen, that I asked the manager if I could go pick up Ron St. Germain and just sort of absorb whatever he, was exuding. Mm-hmm. And he told me to get out of Pittsburgh. Really? He said, you got to get out of Pittsburgh, dude. You got to get out. And Pittsburgh was great. I had just done a record with the Gathering Field that got them a record deal. We did a single that was a big time to be working in Pittsburgh too. Those bands were all doing well. They were all getting deals. The Clarks, Gathering Field, Brownie Mary, House. Yep. And those records were great. I was a freelance guy in Pittsburgh making $15 an hour, which was unheard of money. There was Bob Clearmountain kind of cash or Chris Lord-Alge kind of cash at that point. I wasn't working as much, so I was still staffing at times when I needed work. But he told me get out of Pittsburgh. And in 1995, I would guess, me and my assistant engineer, Romeo Thomas, who went on to
big things in the record company world, and is a partner at Free Solo right now with James Diener and Box and Bomb. He and I moved to New York City, and didn't know anybody. Had a really horrible apartment above the Dunkin' Donuts at the base of the Queensboro Bridge in Queens. We got robbed 3 times in that apartment. And all we owned were clock radios and VCRs. So there's no value in there. I don't know why they kept robbing us, but they kept robbing us. And, just started digging in New York City and just loving life in your 20s. New York City is a great place to be, just working nonstop.
So what kind of work did you find when you first got to New York City?
Did I just tell this story about, with Candace Stewart? Mm-hmm. I just told the story where I went in and I found a studio that was it was a blue collar studio. They had a Trident in there and an analog tape machine. They had an SSL upstairs.
This is Smash.
This is Clay Chef's Smash Studios. Yeah. And this is before they had built the SSL room, in fact. And I just went in and he said that he didn't need an engineer. And I said, just give me 1 session.
Yeah.
Because I knew from Pittsburgh, I just got to get in that room. Every hour I work, he's going to make $75.
So where's your confidence level now that you're in New York City and you're amongst,
I was really worried.
Best in the world?
I was really worried in New York City that I would go there and I would just I'd start off at the bottom, but I started off somewhere in the upper middle because I had all this ability. I'd worked in the secondary market, from working death metal bands to doing the Mr. Rogers show. Okay. Right? To doing film for IMAX in the planetariums, to doing gospel records, to doing symphonies. I had this great education in New York City. I had friends call me panicked because they had to record a drum kit the next day and they had gold and platinum records. And they were like, I've never recorded a drum kit. And right. I was like, I came into that scene and I was like, oh my God, I'm actually like a little bit of a Swiss Army knife here. I've got a little bit of, ability.
That's what you learned in Pittsburgh, right?
I got unwittingly, I had gotten an incredibly diverse education based out of necessity. A studio in Pittsburgh does not survive unless it does videos for the archdiocese, the church, and simultaneously does death metal bands. Right. So that's what that was. And I ended up, I still freelance clients from Pittsburgh that had record label deals, and I'm working in New York trying to scratch up work. So my Pittsburgh job load was still heavy. They were coming to New York, and we were going up into the Hudson Valley and making these records at places like the Clubhouse, and great Neve rooms up there. And I'd mix them in New York City. But I was trying to get into the New York scene, and that happened through Smash Studios and just saying, give me one record.
So you just said to Clay, give me one shot. Now you don't have to deal with me again if this sucks.
I said, book me on a session. Yeah. And I knew if I got in on a session, I knew that I could make them want me, the band.
Right.
And I knew every hour I worked, he made $75. So what idiot turns down $75 an hour to not work? He's dormant. He has a studio.
Right.
I come in at night from midnight till 6 a.m. when his studio is normally closed. And I make him 6 times 7, $420, whatever that is. Right.
So where are you finding the bands to come in now? And
he had them. They were bands
because Smash is also a rehearsal space.
That was a genius move.
Probably an amazing place to mine for bands.
Great. That's one of the things you have to do as a creator, is find creative situations that constantly have new coming work. And Clay, I don't know if he did it. He probably did it because he's so smart. He said, hey, these guys, I can rent them time to rehearse, but then I can also rent them time to record. And he built a studio in the front of that studio was a rehearsal room too. So when it wasn't being used as a recording studio, it was being used as a rehearsal room.
Wow.
Clay is he will make money nonstop because he's just always thinking about stuff like that. And I tried to incorporate that a lot into my philosophy. If I'm going to mix a record, wouldn't it be great nowadays? It's like I'm usually writing songs on the record, producing the record. My studio records it, and I get paid as a producer and mixer. If it doesn't check all those boxes, sometimes I turn records down, just because there's other records that could fit in there that do that I'm inspired by. But yeah, Clay was great at that. And I knew that once I got into the room, I would be able to make it 2 sessions into 4. And then the next thing you know, I'm running that studio.
So obviously that first session went well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he was like, okay, cool. This dude's the real deal.
The stuff we were doing there was it was rudimentary compared to the technical aspect of what I had to learn being the engineer in a market like Pittsburgh.
Right, mobile trucks and SDN lines, ISDN
yes.
rather. Yeah. Okay, so now from Smash, how long do you stay at Smash? And Smash is Smash your home base, or are you working
Smash
around?
Smash is my home base. It was where I lived. I lived in Queens. Eventually, met my wife, and she had an apartment over on 30th and 3rd. So I was just walking back and forth from 30th and 3rd, which is just across the city. It was like going maybe a mile and a half from east to west to get to the studio, which was on 23rd. Yeah. And I spent a ton of time there, and I was just woodshedding. And all those bands, I ended up doing more records. They would say, hey, we don't want to do it at Smash. We want you to mix it at Chung King, or we want you to mix it at Right Track. Because Smash was very limited in what it could do in regards to, they went on and became popular. And as they became popular, they wanted me to go with them because I was part of the records and they needed me for the records. And studios like Pyramid, which was an API room, or Howard DeSalle's, there's all these rooms, or Looking Glass or Loho. These rooms were great rooms that were affordable to still be not like you're going to Hit Factory where it's $2,500 a day, but you could get these rooms for $1,000 a day, and they were big consoles and big gear. So I started making records out of there, but I always stayed there because I love Clay. He's a great human. We had a production company, started developing some stuff together. Then he opened the SSL room upstairs, and I designed that room with Greg Vizza.
Oh, no kidding.
You take the people with you that you respect, and right. So Greg and I designed that room acoustically. Me more as a creator, like, hey, this is what I want out of this room. Him more as the math physicist dude. Built a great mix room up there, and then I got hired by the Berman Brothers, who were booking that room. They had at least for a year, I think, and the Berman Brothers, we were doing all these.
What were the Bermans looking for you to do? Were you engineering?
They needed me to mix records.
Mix records, okay,
and record records.
Yeah, and so this is where you met one of our people we've had on the podcast before, Jeff Copeland, our mutual friend.
I met Jeff Copeland down in Smash earlier because Jeff was producing a lot of records out of Smash.
Okay.
He was in the Hidden Persuaders, which became Splendor, the band that had the big hit record.
This is previous to you getting.
And Near Z was in that band.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
These people stay in your lives over and over again. But so we ended up doing a lot of records together, and then Jeff started working for the Bermans as a programmer.
Explain the Berman Brothers to people that don't know.
The Berman Brothers.
They're kind of a fascinating setup.
They're two brothers, literal German brothers. Yeah, German brothers. And they Christian was the creator, and who was it? Frank was the business guy, and they never crossed lines really. Frank might have an opinion here or there, but it was mostly Christian in the studio, and they got so much work that they couldn't do it. So they hired Jeff Copeland to start doing some ghost producing and programming. And Jeff and I jumped on a record with Jeff, and they had me mix it. There was a big Trident Vector in that room for a minute. So I'm mixing this record on there, and they want me to mix and master the record at the same time in 5 days, 13 songs. And I'm just like, oh, you're killing me. And in those days, the big studio, you needed a day a song with all the gear and recall. And like, you won't need to recall it. It's just EMI Germany. And they wanted me to master it. So I sent it out and brought it back through 2 channels and mastered it through a TC Electronics M5000.
Yeah.
And I printed these mixes, and that record went on to sell 6 million copies. Is massive record.
And they never asked for any changes?
I don't know. No.
Yeah.
The record companies were so hungry at that point that Frank would come into the room and say, do you have anything for me to play? I've got the president of Columbia in here, and I didn't know he was coming. I forgot about the meeting. I need to play him something. Do you have anything like of my songs that I could play him? If only I had my catalog I had today, I'd be a millionaire. But right. They were so busy and overrun with work that, Jeff was mostly ghost producing. And Jeff and I would go do these records that those guys really weren't even there. And if they were there, they were playing pinball. Like, and we went to Toronto to make a record, and they were out playing pinball the entire time. Right. I don't think they were in the control room. It was me and Jeff.
They were Rick Rubin before Rick Rubin.
Genius dudes.
Yeah.
But they were great producers. They did This Is Your Night, which was one of the most synced songs of all times.
The Moffats, which were like
that was that record that I was talking about, the Moffats. And they did the production company ended up doing Bob, the version that crossed over to hit radio. Wow. So they were just attached to all these big records, and they were very talented, but they had more work than they could handle. And me and Jeff sort of ran along behind them with a giant zookeeper broom and did all these other records. And a lot of those records were popular. So that was a big part of that. Okay,
so where do you go from the Bermans now? Because I know that took up a lot. I know you guys were working nonstop on that. Where do you go after?
I was always working upstate. I was always working at other rooms in the city. I was always mixing records. I was always tracking records. it was a busy time doing a lot of film post-production. I did that. It was a gold record I did for Cash Money Millionaires. That was an HBO concert that I did as a video post suite where I mixed all the audio for that. So I was doing a bunch of, I worked on the ad of the century, which was the ESPN ads, late 90s, Susan Sarandon and all these, epic people doing these ads for ESPN. We did a bunch of that stuff. It was just wherever there was work to be done, and it was creatively inspiring. I was mixing a record for the band Stunt Cycle out in Queens at an old mobster hangout that we built a studio in, made a beautiful record out there. So it was a great time because everyone was so creative and there was so much creative work going on. You were just nonstop. And you had to just keep yourself busy. And I did working. I didn't start keeping track of days until I worked 20 hours. And I'd be like, oh, it's 20 hours. I'm going to start paying attention. I worked one session that was 51 and a half hours long, the longest contiguous session that I was an engineer. So it was just a crazy time. And there was no deciding. At that point in my career, I was just trying to get in and be relevant.
What's interesting to me is that you were doing everything that needed to be done, right? You're recording, you're producing, you're writing, you're doing whatever has to be done. That was not necessarily the thing, right? The lines were kind of delineated a little bit. You were a producer, or you were an engineer,
right,
or you're a writer, but you seem to be doing all that. I mean, it's almost like you have to do that now, basically.
Yeah.
But it seems like you're on the forefront of that whole, I have to do everything to survive kind of thing.
Well, everything interested me because I'm curious, right? So like I mastered records. I did a record for Chris Grace, who was a great rock artist. And then he was working with a label, and I ended up mastering records for Steve Earle, the Indigo Girls, Dropkick Murphys, like some legitimate artists.
Definitely.
I'm not a mastering engineer, but it was intriguing to me. And I felt like I can do this if I just make sure that I'm diligent and I can deliver a product that's at par with mastering labs.
How are you getting these gigs, by the way? It's just word of mouth?
I did a record for Chris Grace.
Okay.
And Chris Grace, by the way.
And Chris knows the Dropkick Murphys, and that's how that all works?
Chris's father was the president of BMG Distribution.
Okay.
So he was working with the Universal label group that was doing these recordings and needed them mastered. And so who do you ask? It's like what they say about presidents. Who do presidents cheat with? People that are close with them.
Yeah.
Right? You don't have to be a supermodel. You just have to be close.
Right.
And in the music world, being there is half the deal. I got records in gallery where somebody who had rented a back room, Clay had back rooms even up there. Some guy said, hey, I need to do a vocal. And they'd come in, and that record would go on to be a platinum record. And it was something I put after my schedule at the end of a long mix day.
Wow.
Now, if you had gone in and say, hey, I'll be successful when I have a platinum record, because people say this, right? Hey, what do I want to do? I want to be a successful producer engineer. What's the moniker of success? Platinum record, right? A number one, whatever it is. I got a platinum record for tracking on this record, and I think I mixed it because I was on the floor and they needed a vocal done that day. Right. It turned into more work that turned into a platinum record.
It's like kind of what Candace Stewart was saying the other day about Jeff Ellis, where he was just this really enthusiastic guy. They got the call for Frank Ocean. And she didn't even know who Frank Ocean was, which is amazing. Right. Jeff did it, and now Jeff rents. He's the only tenant they have on one of the SSL rooms.
It's like, hey, it is the key to success is being in a room or adjacent to a room or in a conversation or out smoking a cigar or grabbing a beer after the session where you meet someone else that is the next 6 months of your life. That's just what it is in the music world, at least in New York at that time, and it's that way in Nashville too. You have to be ready to mingle, and just like people call people who are close to them. Chris Grace knew that I cared and that I did everything to the last fiber of what my ability was. He knew that. And by the way, Chris Grace is the reason I got the Grammy. Really? It was a record that Chris Grace, I had done 4 or 5 projects, and Chris's records were great. They were like Tool, Perfect Circle kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, it was so much fun making those records. We'd make these records, and then whenever you put them through the Quest heads, the big far fields, just to hear it, it was like, holy the experience, like immersive when you talk about music going through your stomach, that music did. And Chris was great. Chris had me do these projects. Chris was one of my freelance clients. And then Chris says, hey, I'm going to go do a record with Malcolm Byrne. And he came to me tentatively, like he was dumping me. It felt very much like my girlfriend had just like sat me down after dinner and dumped me. And I could tell that's what his demeanor was. But for me, when I heard it, I was like, dude, that's awesome. It was like, Grammy Award winning dude. Good for you. Here is my U47 and my V72s, my mic pre's. I gave them to him and said, this is like the best your voice has ever sounded and all the things we've ever tried. Take them with you. Go up to Kingston, New York, and make this record. And he did. And I was legitimately, by the way, this is a true lesson that I have learned to be good at, which is be happy for your friends when they have success, even if it's without you, because it's not a natural behavior. It's like, what the heck, Chris? We've got a business going here. How could you? Right? I made the decision to be happy for him. And then I leaned into it. Like I legitimately at that point was happy for him. He went on to make this record with Malcolm. Malcolm mixed the record and it just wasn't happening. So they said, hey, would you be willing to give it a shot? So I mixed a song and Malcolm heard it and he was like, it's incredible. I mixed that record. And then Malcolm said, hey, will you come up and do the Sparkle Horse record with me? So I took a situation where I could have been, screw you guys. I was legitimately happy for Chris, sent him off with my gear, got the mix on the record, and then got a new client. Malcolm hires me to do Sparkle Horse and Rachel Yamagata. And then he's like, I remember I was in a session with him and the guy was playing something and I mic'd the guy's foot because he couldn't stop tapping his foot. So I mic'd it and we made it part of the song. And Malcolm was like, man, that's really pragmatic. Yeah. He's like, hey, would you come to Nashville and make an Emmylou Harris record with me? Wow. So that's how I got to Nashville. My whole story of ending up finding the end of my story or the later parts of my story in Nashville was reliant upon me being happy for Chris Grace when he left me to make a record.
That's amazing.
It's really the truth, man. I've got friends that suffer from this syndrome where they're not able to be happy for their friends.
Yeah.
Nothing good happens for those cats.
No, that's a good takeaway. Yeah, that's a good takeaway.
It always comes back around. If you're really good at something, you're going to be good at it in a month.
Yeah.
They'll come back if what you had was, if they learn that, hey, grass wasn't greener, I'm going to come back. Or maybe it doesn't, but it's all good. There's new work.
Okay. So at this point, you've come to Nashville, you've checked it out, and you and your wife, Kim, decide, you know what? I liked it there. Let's go to Nashville. Had you just had enough in New York, or you just felt like
we had a baby?
You had a baby, right? And you didn't. Yeah.
I never wanted to raise a baby in that yellow section around New York. I was just like, we can't afford to do this. It's not we're not going to be able to give him what he needs. You have to be a multimillionaire to live a normal life like that. I think like what we live down here. Yeah. So I went down and I made the Emmylou Harris record, 2001. So I'd been in New York and
this is with Daniel Lanois, for those that don't know, too.
Malcolm Byrne was the producer, and then Dan Lanois came on and produced, I would say, for about a 2-week period. I worked with Dan.
Yeah.
And then I went back home, and I was just like, it's great down there. Incredible. And then I came back and did something with Warren Zevon and Emmylou Harris for Warren Zevon's last record before he passed.
Right.
So both of those records, by the way, were nominated for Grammys, Emmys, and Warrens in the same category.
Wow.
And Warrens won. And then we were just like, hey, we've got to New York City's too much for us. We're retired. And Nashville was making records somehow that were like all the records that I grew up on.
Yeah.
Country had gone from Kenny Rogers to Keith Urban and Rascal Flatts. And I'm like, this feels like an Eagles record to me. This feels like, Bread, or feels like they are like records like Paul McCartney records, So they were making the right music down here. And then it was Nashville from then on out. Once we came, I remember like 5 years after living here, I turned to Kim and I said, you like it here, right? Because it was so evident. We never asked each other because it was so evident that it was where we were supposed to always be.
Right. Okay. So I know. At what point do you rent your Studio C at RCA? Is this right when you get here?
Well, we had sold our house at the top of the market, so we had some cash.
Right.
We were living off that cash and renting an apartment in Nashville until we could find a house.
Okay.
The month the money ran out, I got a publishing deal with Sony. And I'm convinced, it's one of the, looking back on it, I'm convinced that had I had half as much money, I would have got a publishing deal twice as fast. Right? It was divinely inspired or intervened upon. So I had a mixing room in my second bedroom at this apartment. My poor neighbors. I was
so Nashville, by the way.
Oh man, I was rocking it before it was popular to do that in apartments. And then I leased RCA. I leased an ISO booth in a recording studio off of 8th Avenue, right across from the Murder Mart. This place where people would get killed.
That's okay. You told me.
I leased this. This guy had a giant ISO booth. It was like 15 foot across by 22 foot. And in that room, I just moved in and I started working. And I was working for this guy as an engineer. When he had big symphony dates, I did a 55-piece symphony at Ocean Way for him.
Wow.
And then I would do some mixing for him. But then I was like, I leased this little ISO booth or this big ISO booth from him. And I started working in there. And then I was booking nonstop through there. I did the Mike Logan record out of there. I did a bunch of the Flyleaf records out of there. And, I was dropping Daylight I did out of there. And I was doing so much work that he was getting annoyed that his ISO booth was dominating his studio. So eventually he asked me to leave. So I left. And then that's whenever I leased RCA Studio C, which is Chet Atkins' old room.
And what are you doing when you get to Nashville? Same deal? You're just trying to find any bands that want to work? Like, at what point do you start getting into writing? You're obviously an incredibly successful writer.
It's never one of those deals where you go out and look for work as much as like your friends say, I need something done. Scott Stepikoff needed something mixed. Right. So he had like a solo record he did. So I mixed that in my spare bedroom at the apartment. And then somebody hears that record. Or Mike Logan somehow comes on the radar and I produce Mike's record, and then people hear Mike's record. Mike's record is still, after all these years, people still come to me and say, oh, you did that first Mike Logan record, Incredible artist, by the way. Check him out. And it just grows like that, word of mouth. And then I did the Flyleaf record, and then this Christian label, because Flyleaf was on A&M Octone, but that was the real world
release. Is this through your relationship with Rome?
Rome was working there, so yes, it would have been.
Everything's built on relationships, right?
I mean, it's great point. And I was working with Yu Ting, who was James Diener's A&R assistant. Yeah. And Yu Ting and I developed a relationship, but Romeo was always throwing my name around, like a good buddy. And I had done a bunch of records. I did the Flyleaf EP that kind of blew them up. And then I worked on their big record that Howard Benson, George Benson, that Howard did. I produced and did a couple songs that ended up on that record, separate from Howard's workflow. But Romeo kept putting me in. But for the Flyleaf record, there was a Christian world release of that record because those guys were Christian. And it was called INO SRE, I think was the label. And James Diener there started hiring me to do Christian records. So I'm kicking out every 15 days. I'm kicking out records,
right?
Major, and these are good budget records. And when they couldn't pay me my rate, they were giving me points on the record. So, instead of making $2,000 a mix, I'd make $1,500 a mix, but I get a point on the record. Right. Okay. And I'm just working nonstop. And that was all out of that Studio C over at RCA.